Well, on a previous episode of The American Landman, we talked about tapping maple trees and how much fun it was to make some fresh maple syrup. Well, today we're going to show you the actual process of how we boil it down, the equipment, and in the end, I hope to get a couple gallons of fresh maple syrup. So if you ever wondered how the process is done, we're going to show you. Stick around, and that's today's episode on The American Landman. So we're starting with about, 15 gallons of sap. And what we're doing is we're simply pouring this fresh maple water. This is the sap that came right out of the tree. And inside this pot here is a maximum fill line. So we're going to fill it to about that. We got the propane going, and it's going to start heating up. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to bring this to a vigorous boil. Get it boiling, and it'll just boil off the water, and you're going to start to see this vaporize. And what it does is over the course of the next 5 to 8 hours, we're going to slowly cook this sap down, condensing those sugars. And then once we get it done, we're going to pull off some of the sap, and we're going to take it in the house, and then we're going to finish it off. We've got a couple basic pieces of equipment. We got a thermometer here that we will follow the temperature of the sap. We wanted to get it to about 210 to 218 degrees roughly. And then we have some simple filters that we'll use to filter off the sap, make sure if there's any contaminants in there, anything that maybe fell off the trees, we'll filter the sap out. And then eventually we'll put it in some mason quart jars and make sure these are nice and clean. Stick them downstairs, put a date on them so we know, and hopefully we're going to have about a gallon of sap, maybe 2. So that's the process. Now it's time to sit back and let it boil. You know, I'm going to be the first to tell you I am no expert when it comes to maple syrup making, but as I drive around northern Wisconsin, I come across so many of these facilities and they're making syrup, and I stop in, I purchase some, and I thought, you know, it'd be really fun to do this myself. So what I did is I simply went around in my area and I found a friend that had some maple trees, and I asked him, hey, can I tap your trees? And we probably put maybe a dozen or 2 taps out and started collecting sap. And the process of sap collection takes maybe, I'm going to say it took 2 weeks to gather the sap. And we'd get 5-gallon buckets. I'd go over there and we'd check them, and some of them weren't producing, some of them were, and we started collecting the sap. Took the sap home, put it in a big Rubbermaid trash container that we cleaned out really well, and that was our storage bin. And one thing that happened in the process is we came back and we got our second maybe 30, 40 gallons worth of sap, and you're not going to believe this, but that bin collapsed and it fell over and all the sap went running all over our garage. So lesson learned. Next year we're going to get a little bit more sturdy container, or at least maybe not fill that one so full, but that's something that happened. So the second thing I did was I got a book, and this book, How to Make Maple Syrup by Stephen and Allison Anderson. A great little book, and the way I got this book was I had a maple bush, a maple forest for sale, a piece of land, about 80 acres, and the owner and his brother made maple syrup there, and I was kind of enamored by the process. I wanted to learn how it was done because I surely love to eat it, and I knew they were going to give me a little bit, and they did. They ended up giving me a case of it, but I was showing interest in the process because I really wanted to do it myself, and he gave me this book, and he says, look, this is real easy. So a couple things in here I wanted to talk to you about that I just thought it made this whole video a little interesting, and that's how maple syrup became a thing in North America. Now, I don't know if these stories are true, but they're the wives' tales, the legends that go along with it, and it goes something like this. Supposedly an Indian brave was out hunting, and he was in the forest, and he came back empty-handed after a couple days, and he was really frustrated. He took his tomahawk and he threw it against a tree, and it stuck. Underneath that tree, his wife had put a container, and as that hatchet pierced the bark of the tree, as the sap started flowing out of it, ran down the tomahawk into that container. Well, she came back at the end of the day and found this container full of something, thinking her husband, the big old hunter, had brought her something to cook. So she started cooking it. She started boiling it down, and it became maple syrup. And they used it to sweeten their foods. And that's some truth to that. Well, sometime after the settlers arrived, the Indians started teaching the white man how to make syrup, and they started to improve on the process. They learned that if they would tap or drill a hole or take a hatchet and slash it and maybe put a piece of birch bark, they could run that sap into a container. And they started using buckets, wooden buckets and clay pots, and later they moved on to metal, and then eventually today we use plastic, or they even rig up systems of tubes all throughout the woods running downhill to a container where all that sap flows down, thereby reducing the work that it takes to collect the sap. Well, it takes maybe 2 weeks to collect the sap, and Nick and I collected probably about 100 gallons using 5-gallon buckets. On the warm days, it would really flow, and then at night, the temperature would drop below freezing. It would slow down. As the temperature heated up, it would start to flow again, and over the couple weeks, we captured about 100 gallons of sap. Now, the health benefits of the sap are many. Imagine all the micronutrients, manganese and electrolytes and minerals that are pulled out deep from within the soil by that tree to feed the foliage. Well, that's the benefit of maple syrup. Very healthy for you, and it's delicious as well. So let's talk a minute about when to tap maple syrup. Well, the best time, according to the book, is early spring, late winter. In the area where I live here in the Midwest, I'm in northern Wisconsin. I started tapping sometime in early March, and I just finished up, and it's now about March 25th as I film this. But wherever you're at, it may differ. But what you want to look for are some extended periods of warm weather where it warms up to maybe into the 40s during the day, drops down into freezing, below freezing at night. That freeze-thaw cycle begins the sap flow. And what you'll typically get is probably about 15 days of sap running per season. So some days the sap is going to run more and you're going to collect more. And some days, as I experienced, when you go out there, it'll run less and you won't get much and you'll think it's not working. But 15 days of sap flow was plenty of time to collect the 100 gallons that I finally got put away. Now, according to the book here, there's going to be different grades of syrup. And it's going to be determined by the type of tree, how early you tap it, and the bacteria that naturally grows on the tree that helps the tree heal, and in the bacteria that builds up on your equipment throughout the season. Now, it's normal and it's not going to harm you, but let's talk about it a little bit. The bacteria, what it does is it helps heal that tree. Once you tap that tree, you introduce the bacteria, and the bacteria does the natural process of healing that wound. A couple tap holes are not going to bother the tree. I've had that question in the last week. It doesn't hurt the tree at all, and it'll start to heal itself. But that bacteria that is not only in the tree and in your equipment is going to cause different colorations. Now, here's our syrup. This came from First Run syrup. You can see it's very watery. It's got a nice light amber color. As the season progresses, the sap not only changes, but the bacteria starts to work on the sap, and then it's going to move into from a light grade A, which is what this is, to a darker, thicker, that'll be maybe a grade A medium or an amber, and then when it's really late in the season, it'll be really dark, really strong, very concentrated. That's more commercial grade. They can sometimes they'll add sugar to it to sweeten it up. So what we were looking for is the First Run sap. That's what we got. Very light, very, very delicate, kind of watery. I can't wait to try this. You know, just a few minutes ago, my daughter Lauren came by and said, "Dad, why do you do this? You know, what's so fun about sitting out in the garage all day?" And I tell you, it definitely is a process, so you have to have a little bit of patience. But to me, there's just something about going out to your land and producing food from it, be it hunting for deer, which we all love, or tapping maple syrup and making maple syrup for your pancakes or sweeteners or whatever. But it's definitely a process that takes some time. You have to have all day. Now, I've been boiling this pod for, I'm going to say 3 or 4 hours, and it's gone down maybe an inch an hour. As it's been boiling, I've been adding a little bit of sap to it, and then we'll eventually get all the sap in here. And then the next step here is going to be to siphon off some of the syrup sap into another container, and then I'll go inside my house and I'll finish it. So I've got an Orlon filter, and in another 3 or 4 hours, I'm going to open up the spigot, I'm going to filter this sap, while it's nice and hot through this Orlon, it's going to take out all the impurities, any particulate that's, you know, fallen into the pot or come off the trees. And then I'm going to take it in the house and we're going to finish it. Now the finishing, you can have a couple tools, a hydrometer, there's a couple thermometers that you could utilize, but we're keeping this pretty simple. All we're going to do is we're going to use a temperature thermometer because we know that at 212 degrees at sea level, water boils. And the sap will turn to syrup when it's about 7 degrees above boiling. So we estimate about 219 degrees. So at 219 degrees, when we take a sample of the syrup and put the thermometer in, we know we'll have sap and then we'll be done. So it's a pretty simple process with not many tools, but we just got to sit back, maybe enjoy our adult beverage or two, and wait for the sap to cook. Okay, well, we're down to the last stage of the sap. It's now about it's about midnight, and I've been at this since about noon, so a good 12 hours. And what I've done is I've reduced the sap down to the point where I brought it into the house now for the finishing stages. So as you'll see from the looks of the sap, it's now taken on that amber color that we start to recognize when we think of syrup. And we're finishing it off by bringing it to a full boil. Water will boil at about 210, 211 degrees Fahrenheit. We're going to get the sap up to about 225 degrees, and then it'll change from sap to syrup. And we'll do that with our thermometer. So this is kind of the tricky stage of the process. We don't want to overdo it. We want to keep an eye on the temperature, but we're almost done. Okay, well, we're down to the last couple steps here. So what I've done is I brought in stock pots, filled them all full of sap, and I'm transferring them smaller down to the final pot, and this is my finishing pot. So I've got my thermometer, and what I'm doing is I'm bringing this up to a boil, and I'm going to try to get it to 225 degrees. Then the sap will turn to syrup, and we'll take it from the small pot and we'll transfer it into our receptacles, our mason jars, which I've sterilized and cleaned, and we'll be good to go. And at that point, we'll put a top on it, put a date, and we'll be done. Now this is first run syrup out of a sugar maple. It tends to be delicate and a little bit thin. It's not going to be thick like Aunt Jemima, which is not even maple syrup. This is the real stuff. But I want this to thicken up a little bit, and you could tell how it's starting to get there. I've condensed this sap down, and I keep pulling off and pulling off and pulling off into my final pot. You got to be careful that you don't burn it though, so watch it closely. I'm looking for a nice boil, fine little bubbles. I'm just testing it every now and then. I'll just grab a ladle and I'll just kind of see, does it look watery or does it look like it's starting to thicken up? And it's definitely starting to thicken up. So it's almost there. I'm talking quiet because it's 1:52 a.m. I'm still cooking. I started at noon today. Okay, well, I think we're just about done. I've been condensing this sap, and you can see it's taken on a really nice amber color. It's light and it's delicate. It's not going to get really thick. It tastes awesome. We got maple syrup. So the next step is getting it filtered. So what we do is we have a two-stage filter here. There's a paper filter, and then this is called Orlon. It's more of a fiber, and we're going to filter this twice through here. And what that does is it removes some of the sediment and the sugars that are in the sap, the minerals and the sugar sand, as we call it. So we just take our ladle, we transfer it into our very clean mason jars here, one at a time, making sure we don't overflow. Let that Orlon and that paper filter it out. And then once we got it filtered, put a top on nice and tight. And there we go. That is real maple syrup here. Now people ask me, why do I do this? And I tell you, this is my first time ever, but there's something about taking food from the earth, be it hunting for whitetail or in this case sap, or out of my garden with berries and whatnot, and vegetables during the summer. I love doing this. It's just something that brings you closer to Mother Nature. I hope you've enjoyed it. And hey, if you're interested in doing this, it's really simple. If I can do it, you can do it. Just get a book, go online and start boiling sap. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I'm Neil Hauger, and I'm a land specialist for Whitetail Properties Real Estate, and you've been watching The American Landman. A couple more minutes and we'll do another jar.